that, I mean, I've been with a lot of stuff going on. Unfortunately, life intrudes. Undoubtedly, you've learned or will continue to learn that there was just so much going on. I, I'm hopeful I was attentive enough, but we really have to get busy. There's only so much I can do, and that's on me. So I'm trying to find what's important. So I wanted to start with this because it's a very good clinical chapter. And if you look on the blackboard, I downloaded this to Marie, not the Marie Baker. This is Nestor's. I just uploaded it onto your blackboard today. Slide down and find it. And it's basically, I like this part because I feel to get attention going and back into the flow, we need to do stuff that's clinically oriented, meaning we talk about diseases, we talk about things that impact people. And so, even though we covered some of that, I'll show you the brief review. And remember, this is what we kind of left it with. How do we classify? Genetically, DNA or RNA for both. Envelope or non-envelope, we always call that naked, so I use the terms interchangeably. And then somehow the shape or architecture. And typically we use the term isometric for that one. That's the icosahedron. If you remember that 20-sided geometric figure. Isometric is the sides are all the same. Filamentous, helical, linear. And if it's not one of those two, pleiform. What we're talking about here are viruses that impact us. We'll see the term animal viruses because viruses have a lot of range. Just to reiterate, range means not geographically, but range means species. Right. So, and you've already seen it with COVID. It affects birds, it affects members of the bird families, avian, swine related to pig, the various species, horses, bats. There's any number of species that are affected, and they're all animals. In fact, those are pretty much all mammalian viruses that are there, and there's more. Okay. Right here. So those that impact us were animals, not plants, not bacteria, not archaea, and how they spread. And this is how we classify them. We're going to start with DNA viruses. Comment briefly, their shape's fairly straightforward. Naked or enveloped is a big player. Then another handout I have to send you. Get to that probably. And then something else that comes along with regard to this mode of transmission. Typically, not always, the way that it's spread, the way you get it is the way you spread it. So we start with fecal to oral, just what it sounds. So basically, we ingest these, it enters our body and it's excreted from our body in various forms, feces. And these are, when you start talking about, the one you're hearing most about these days is norovirus, which we'll get to, perhaps not today. Norovirus, because it is profound diarrhea, vomiting, and very, very hard to get rid of on surfaces, and blah, 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 blah. Anybody in food service, it quickly spreads. If you're going to work in a hospital, it goes to crazy. Work in a nursing home, it goes to crazy. They close schools. Respiratory, typically, you inhale it, go off and exhale. Pretty straightforward. Zoonotic. Common. Those are, when we use a classification like that, that's typically how it spreads. It's not exclusively. For instance, if fecal to oral, if someone had it on their hands and you had an open wound and they touched you unprotected, conceivably you get in your bloodstream that way. So this is the most common way that it's spread. Okay, same thing with respiratory. Conceivably, it could go directly into the bloodstream or invade by some other means. Zoonotic is a classic example. It means that some other member of the animal kingdom has given it to you. Classic rabies. Not the only way. It doesn't have to come from a rabid animal. You can do person-to-person transmission. Rabid individual can expose a non-rabid individual. Maybe I told you about that. This lady who was a nurse at a psych unit over at St. Francis, where Children's was bitten by a patient who later succumbed. They found post-mortem he was rabid, and she had to go through a very unpleasant way of treating that. Fortunately, that has changed. And then lastly, the one that we hear so much about, you mistakenly call it sexually transmitted. It doesn't have to be, although that's certainly frequent. classically you would classify it as blood or body fluid exposure plus close intimate contact. So sometimes, again, a frictional component or something along those lines, and that classically is how the first one we're going to look at, HPV, is spread. So we'll get there. I'll download it from another one if we get to it today. When we talk about herpes viruses, there's a lot. Just in case, it's not just one. So I think I have a handout for that as well. And I have to upload that also. Nevertheless, here we go. So and it just reiterates some of the stuff. They discovered it. Virus means poison. You already knew about that. Interestingly, the reason tobacco mosaic, because it's tobacco. And that was such an enormous cash crop for such a long time. That's why they started to look for that. And the whole idea, I don't really make a big deal about filterable viruses because you can't see them with a light microscope, but they still have an impact. So yeah, inert particles, they don't do anything. They invade cells in some way, shape, or form, and they take over. They're inert outside, one's inside. So we call them obligate intracellular parasites that are there. Agents, because organism implies living things we've talked about. We require living organisms as hosts. And yeah, we could grow cells that have viruses, but we can't, effectively, we can't grow the viruses in and of themselves outside in pure culture, so to speak. And too small to be seen with a light microscope. And again, whether they affect eukaryotic cells or prokaryotic cells, we're sort of going into here, obviously animal viruses, obviously eukaryotic cells. And they just give you an idea of all those different things. Those you might remember we talked about were bacteriophage. Those actually look like that. They're very strange. And I'll come back and look at those, okay? And so a lot of times when we study them, we utilize these viruses that affect bacteria and see the impact on the bacteria because it's a living cell. So we use these for study, and you might remember my comments about it, that now we're looking at it closely because inevitably they destroy the cell. And we're looking at this as an alternative down the road, possibly for antibiotics, which we're running out of. And you've heard a number of times, that's a recurrent theme, and we're getting to that pretty closely. Second half of the term, we spend most of, maybe just as we approach break and after break, talking a whole lot about things that are clinically oriented. Antibiotics is a big topic. Okay. And ecologically, medically is where they're driving, not do the size stuff and the size stuff. So, there's a red blood cell, how small those are. There's an E. coli. You've all seen those magnified 1,000 times. Aha. And then the same type of thing, again, the big distinction and why we see such a significant, how should I say it, problem associated with naked viruses like this is the idea of the protein spikes. Again, here you can see this isometric. The capsids are the capsid has identical 20 of these 20-sided figures. They are all, so it's basically equilateral triangles. That's why we call it isometric for each of these sides is the same. But the protein spikes here are directly outside, and this is really it's very self-contained. You have the genetic material on the interior, you have the protein shell on the exterior. That's it. And things that are simple, there's not a whole lot of stuff we can do about them very easily. Okay, we don't have a lot of targets to attack whatsoever. Whereas at least here, from a standpoint of controlling them in the environment, we have effectively a piece of membrane that the spikes have attached to. Membranes, relatively easy to get rid of. Envelopes, a good organic solvent. Alcohol will get through it. I mean, we're not even talking about, Clorox or diluted bleach or a variety of other solutions we're going to learn about. Very, very efficient. Okay, and that's because that provides a target. It's not a layer of protection, it's a target. And they go into this, and you can see the different ways it's arranged and all these things. So complex, typically the word complex we associate with bacteriophage, which we're going to look at because there's not a whole lot. I don't include a whole lot for our purposes on bacteriophage, but there's a couple little nuggets that are there. And I wouldn't be doing that today. And pleiform is, again, sort of a generic term for something not here, something different than either the icosahedral or isometric or the helical or filamentous. Hi, how are you? Yes. Yes.
Just have them scan the QR code, download the app.
I shall.
Thank you.
Very well. Very good. And here you have, now we don't do the taxonomy, don't worry about it. The reason this PowerPoint, I love this. This is the way I do it. So I want to go past this. We're going to use these. I'm going to talk. You're not going to see a whole lot of other illustrations for a while. It's just me blabbing. And I know you've missed that. I know. Sorry. Even we broke down and were drinking margaritas. Hey. They'll say about when in Rome. The names were, I don't get very, Viridae is more of a formal term. We'll get into that. You know, you'll be aware of the ones that you have to know. Sometimes they're named for the disease, where they came from, et cetera, et cetera. This is the idea. Fecal to oral. And you're going to see, I'll point out the exceptions. For instance, something that we're hearing a lot now topically because of a renewed interest in the safety of vaccines is polio. Okay. Polio, even though you get it fecal to oral, it isn't communicable. You can't give it to somebody else. And that's a mistaken notion. And that was a pervasive notion ages ago. We'll probably get to that on Friday. When someone started to develop polio back in the 20s, it was called infantile paralysis. And they would shun people because we didn't know any better. It was like when HIV first came out and AIDS. They would shun individuals because they had no idea how it spread. And until you begin to identify those things. So interestingly enough, now HIV and AIDS, obviously there's an element of that can be spread rather easily, unfortunately. Polio not so, because we don't shed that particle, even though we get it fecal to oral. It's very unique in that regard. So fecal to oral, respiratory, zoonotic. Years ago, I just call it zoonotic because they used to call it arboviruses for arthropod-borne. And I mean, arthropods are insects. And we get, and obviously, a lot from mosquitoes predominate, ticks, lice. Those are all a variety of insects that have the capability of fleas and things like that that spread diseases, not only just viruses. And you can see a wide range. Yellow fever, maybe one of the early ones, something called dengue, West Nile. Interestingly, they're all in the same category. So there's a lot to be said about those, depending on where you live, what kind of work did you do. A lot of these become more relevant for many of you if you end up doing medical missions, Doctors Without Borders, things like that. And we've had plenty of students graduate from here in nursing and other fields, both electively and and wanting to do this and go into a variety of things that it becomes very relevant, very, very relevant. That's there. Nevertheless, and so this is basically where, and then lastly, of course, sexual contact, sexually transmitted, whatever you want to call it, but I think it's better named blood or body fluids. They give you some idea what they are. Okay? This is when you get stuck with me. So we have DNA viruses, and we have 2 pages of RNA viruses, not that we always are relevant. And there's more information now than there used to be. And we start very, very simply with the one virus that is responsible, and you will hear me say this again and again and again, 15 to 30% of all cancers are directly related to viral infections. Surely half or more of those are related to papillomavirus, human papillomavirus, HPV. And make no mistake, this is not something that's exclusive to what we associate mostly with cervical carcinoma. It is by no means exclusive to women. It can affect men adversely, and it's extraordinarily common. It is the very same virus, but there are different types. As you'll see, we revisit warts a lot. These are warts. So whether it's a common wart you have in the bottom of your foot or on your finger, and lots of people have them. I've treated thousands. Easily, I've removed thousands of those. And the reality is, okay, that they're everywhere. And it's very easy to get them. What's interesting about them, they're all different types. And some of them have that capability to be transmitted by close, intimate contact. This is not something that's blood or body fluid. If you did not know it, if you go back and we all did skin together, okay, and whether it's Dr. Robbins up in the lab, you remember, I know this is going back, way back in time. Remember there's the layers of skin, the strata, stratum basal, stratum spinosum, the spiny layer, stratum, the next one, granulosum, where the cells start to flatten and die. That's where you see inclusion bodies. The way we stain, the DNA gets there. If you want to paint with a broad brush, DNA viruses have a nasty tendency to become latent. What does that mean? They enter the cell, and like in the case of this, they basically become, the DNA incorporates itself with the nucleus of the cell it's invading and takes over. And it's permanent. For instance, if it's just a garden variety wart, you can get rid of the wart, but that virus is inside of you. Are you ever going to have it again? Maybe not. But now you have been exposed. That is the problem with this. And we will, again, we're going to look at this vis-a-vis skin. And then lastly, we're going to look at it with regard to reproductive or genitourinary infections, where it's more relevant. Why is it such a big problem? Not because of the, I don't worry about the strandedness. It's naked. Okay, that's the most important part. We call it papilloma. The oma suffix, tumor, a wart, whether it's a venereal wart or a cervical carcinoma and related wart or a penile wart, they are still tumors. They meet all the criteria. They are, however, most of the time they're benign entities. Some are not. The reason why it's very similar on the male and on the female, the cervical lining cells it's a moist lining. The skin is very, very delicate around the external genitalia in both men and women, and that's why it's susceptible to this. And we've seen this in a variety, and some of them are very bizarre in their appearance. In any of these textbooky ones, they always have bizarre pictures that you're like, oh my God. Okay, how could somebody have that? Some cause warts, other cause cancers. There's nothing else to it. The reality is that most people have been exposed, if they're sexually active, probably by the time, I'm going to tell you, maybe by mid to late 20s, nearly everybody has been exposed in some way, shape, or form to this. Not necessarily demonstrating it, which is why, and we'll revisit this again, with regard to the Gardasil or the similar immunizations, okay, that have been employed for this as a preventative means, and they're very effective. They still, unless I have to revisit the rule, it was like from 11 to 25, I'm thinking off the top of my head. Okay. So, I mean, you might, there's some note with regard to those things. So there's a comparatively limited window. Moreover, when it comes to viruses, the problem is it's not like we have antibiotics. We do have antivirals, but they're very, very limited. We do a chapter. When we do the antibiotics, we talk about antivirals. The best antivirals are pretty much limited that are most commonly utilized, and they are for herpes type infections. That's Valtrex and things like that many of you have heard about. That's a really very useful category. So all the other ones have a lot of problems. I'll talk more about that when we start talking about antivirals. So there's a ton of information. So human papillomavirus, big problem. It's naked. It's oncogenic. It can cause tumors depending on the type. We type them. You'll see type 16, type 17, type 20. When they formulate the vaccine, they kick out X number of types, and the vaccine is formulated for that. And so when the original Gardasil immunization, which I think came from Merck, the pharmaceutical company, and then they merged so much. I don't even know if Merck's just Merck by itself. But effectively, that's what you'll see it, because it goes into the ones that are there. So be very, very aware of that. throughout our discussion, and particularly we get into the diseases toward the latter end of it. I said, this is my field. I try to present all of you with information, how you respond to it, how that impacts you. I think inherently, I'll say it a number of times. Inherently, we have to be responsible for our actions. You know, how you choose to conduct. But if you're living a at-risk lifestyle, without me getting too graphic about it, you need to at least be wary and take appropriate precautions, or get evaluated, get checked medically periodically. Enough said. You do your own thing in life. So, I don't like to be judgmental about things like that. Everybody does their own thing. You have the advantage of some knowledge. When we were your age, it was a very interesting time. I was born in 1951, if you did not know. So 67 was the Summer of Love, 69 was Woodstock, the early 70s, the term was called casual sex. I mean, it was, trying to say, very limited precautions or barriers were employed. So a lot of us, really was. I'm amazed how many people survived as long with having an attendant amount of problems. I really am, because the risk factors were there. The diseases, not just viruses, but bacterial diseases, were certainly still there. So now we have a little more knowledge, and I think it's important everybody learns about that now, and then conduct your life the way you feel is appropriate. Hey, nevertheless, that's the big number here. Years ago, we had the same category, had a different name. It was called papova, papilloma, polyoma viruses. Now we separate them. So this is a very similar virus. You might remember, going back again to those 4 types of lining cells, okay, in the epithelia of the skin. Merkel cells were the ones that sat on top of little nerve endings. I don't go back. You had keratinocytes, melanocytes, Langerhans cells, and Merkel cells. This is interesting. A cancer. The guys in Margaritaville, Key West, Jimmy Buffett. He died of that. He died of a Merkel cell carcinoma. So they exist. They're just not that terribly common. Okay. A lot of times when I just knowing what the culture is like, and how people are out constantly. That's another one of it. If you get a chance to go to Key West, go. Nothing for the experience. It was kind of like where my daughter at the party. I think there was a Key West crowd, except these, at least they mostly had clothes on. I digress. Okay, that's so far. Non-enveloped, non-enveloped, non-enveloped. This one, adenoviruses. This is the DNA version. Okay, so these two are associated with cancer. These two incorporate with the nucleus. This one we do not think as much. This is the adenovirus. Adeno means gland. So you notice in the categories here, we have to look at different things. We have to know what their category is, DNA or RNA. These are all DNA. Enveloped versus non-enveloped. Okay, and then these so far are all isometric that we've examined here. And indeed, most of this category is isometric in nature. The only oddball down is the pox virus. But these spread sexually transmitted. These certainly by contact transmitted. Could there be some impact of exposure to ultraviolet light, a la skin cancer? Possibly. That particular one, I do not know. I'm not that familiar with it. But this is respiratory. Where did that come from? Adeno means gland. The most common cold virus is, as you will see, a rhinovirus. Okay, that's an RNA virus. There's another RNA virus whose name you're familiar with called coronaviruses. Originally, they were just common cold viruses. Every so often, you get some oddballs, and now all of a sudden we have a unique problem. They are basically upper respiratory-based infections. That has to go with mutations. The adenovirus is similar in the sense it's a cold virus, but typically it involves a more severe cold. Cold that has a fever, cold that has a sore throat, cold that has a swollen. Revisit these when we do respiratory. So, and again, why do we see them all the time? Not enough. I commented on this one earlier when we talked about parvoviruses. Parvo usually, the implication is animal-based viruses. It's something the dog gets. Typically, the dog gets a diarrheal virus. Well, I mean, it's not, there's so many different strains of these viruses that the parvo virus, in this particular, is another naked virus. And again, when we look at skin diseases, we think this is spread most likely respiratory. It could be by contact. It's not clear. If I identify a spread that we are aware of, the way it is transmitted, then that's something you might have to answer. If I don't know, I'm not going to ask you. And I'm going to give the store away for the next exam. Don't think. One of the questions, this is the answer. A, equals oral, B, respiratory, C, zoonotic, or blood and body. Now I'm going to give you like 5 or 6 diseases. You'll have to pick. See, you already, I gave you the answer. You don't think it's part of the service.
So we have to know all, like,
No, just the ones I told you.
Okay.
I will tell you the ones that are, no, you did not memorize it. What am I going to ask you a question about adenovirus for sure? About HPV? Sure. Parvo, fifth disease. We actually probably see a little bit more of that in that fifth disease because you'll see it's more related to skin problems. So some of it we'll get to here, and some of it, and actually on the study guide for the next, I didn't send you that yet. Yeah, I think I've identified which ones you have to know. Except I'm taking it off of that one I sent to you. I thought you missed the bad jokes, but no, you're all sitting there looking stoic. With one person smile? I know. Everybody, half of you are asleep. I know. It's cold. I don't blame you. I mean, it was every day was 80 degrees and gorgeous. And I come back to, looking to get my car and the windchills were below zero. At least we had the foresight to bring along a coat. Next time I'm going to get somebody to pick us up. That's all I'm going to do. That's ridiculous. I'm skipping the herpes viruses for now. Okay. This is parvo, again, a naked virus. Come back to that, to the herpes viruses very shortly. Fifth disease, not sure about how it's spread, but you should be aware that it affects the skin. The fact that in one species, one type produces gastrointestinal problems, it doesn't preclude for us because being a skin disease and a minor upper respiratory infection. That's what fifth disease looks like, or slap cheek syndrome, as is known. Very briefly about all of these are isometric except this one. This is pox viruses. Pox viruses probably are pleiform. They are very large. Certainly they are the largest size-wise of the viruses we talk about that impact us. And surely the most famous one is smallpox. But it's not the only one. And really, we did the whole number on smallpox. You remember with Jenner, him coming up with identifying another pox virus, cowpox. So we don't really have to revisit it. I mean, you can't paint with a broad brush. Okay, that's an invalid virus. So if there were smallpox was a scourge, it killed, that and plague killed so much of Europe and so many times that it's beyond reckoning. And indeed, when not just the conquistadors, when anybody came to try to settle what they called the New World, why were they in such small numbers and able to be so successful? They brought smallpox. They brought plague to this world, and the native cultures had no ability to defend it. They were all sick, dying, something that they had never seen before. I mean, you were dealing with better trained troops, armed troops with more sophisticated weapons, in the early stages of muskets and weapons like that, but they were well organized with a certain degree of armor, opposed to bows, arrows, and spears, but vastly outnumbered, hundreds, if not thousands to one. But these were, understand, that was early, they didn't know it, that was early biological warfare. They didn't know that what they used to do, because they knew that what they had burned dead bodies, when people died in battle, laying siege, they would take catapults and they catapulted dead bodies into, walled cities. Don't think for a minute that this is anything new under the sun about this. People understand, but they didn't know how it was spread, or hey, we're not going to be throwing up dead bodies in there. So just to give you some idea, so the pox viruses are an enveloped virus. And smallpox is the ultimate biological weapon. It's respiratorily spread. When it affects people, it's very rapid, 3 to 4 days. And at that point, the vast majority of them are going to die. No, we do not have an effect. Thankfully, because of the immunization, yes, there have been treatments that are on board, and believe me, somewhere stored, there's some kind of vaccine, somewhere, and there's some kind of antiviral that get cooked up just in case it resurfaces. That's what they do. The smallpox virus is there. And again, the two viruses were closely related, though the cowpox didn't affect us severely. That was the whole thing. What are we hearing about today? Oh my God, they're going to make another vaccine. Monkeypox. Again, it's very similar to cowpox. It doesn't, as far as we know, it has no long-term impact. It may be cosmetic, and we're beginning to see it's monkeypox, and oh my goodness, everybody's wrong. The fact that we've identified something that's been around and causes some problems does not mean that, frankly, that we need to make another vaccine. Because vaccines, as we'll talk about, have their own limitations and their own risks. And this is in the same category. Interestingly, if you did not know, there is a sexually transmitted disease that we revisit again in the poxvirus category. It's called molluscum contagiosum. Since I have seen it clinically, you will see it clinically very quickly. Generally, we see it in the upper thigh area. It's one of these by the frictional component of individuals having intercourse. And it gets its name, it's like a raised red, it's not really a wart, it kind of looks a little bit like a wart, but not, but it's like raised and red, and we'll see it in subsequent chapters, and it has like a white center. And the reason they said mollusk, they thought it was like that phylum has oysters and clams in it. So it was like the pearl inside of the oyster, and contagiosum tells you it was contagious. That's interestingly, that is something that doesn't stay with you. Molluscum contagiosum, what we would do with it, we would numb the area locally and cauterize it. That was, we take it as an electric needle boot. But one of those ones that you had treatment that would destroy it, it was not something that lingered with you. So that, and you'll hear about that. Depending on the work you do and the area that you do the work, you'll run into these kinds of things. Give me a half a second to cook this up. I didn't think we'd get to herpes that fast, but let's have a party anyway. We can get through some of it. Right? Nobody thinks you're humorous. They don't like you anyway. See if I can find it. Don't give me a hard time. See, if I was on top of my game, I would have already figured this out. I'm still in. Do I have it? I hate to have to draw it. Is that work? Are you able to see these YouTubes, the ones that I have been sending, or not? I mean, have they been listenable, accessible when I've tried? Pardon me? Yeah, that type of stuff. You got them okay? Compare. I wonder where I put this. Oh, sugar. Well, excuse me. I'm trying to be helpful. Oh, you're awful. Go ahead. I won't be. I'll go back. That's why I don't throw these things away. You never can tell when you're going to need them. I wonder if I sent it to people. Sure. I probably did it as an email. All right. Now I can do it the easy way because I can write, and I have this as a document in any event, so we can go back and take a look at it. There's really not much to say. I mean, there's nothing to look at when we start looking at the aspect of a herpes virus. There's really not much to say. It's an isometric virus. It's enveloped. There's a whole category. So there's not just one. There's many. Maybe that's the best way to address it, just to start with that concept. There's one there. So you have her name is HHV. Stands for human. Now I'm putting the handout of it's in human herpes virus. Third most common sexually transmitted infection is genital based. So we have, and these are the ones that we deal with. HHV, and I'm just going to, I'll get through 3, 4, actually 5, and we type 3, 6 again, 6 very simple. They all have different names, we'll give them all the time. This one is called HSV1, stands for herpes. Almost all of us have been exposed to this herpes simplex type 1 oral. This is HSV2. HSV2, herpes simplex type 2, is genital. I will tell you this now, that they are interchangeable. In general, the difference we see was depending on the kind of contact that people choose to have intimately. You can get type 1 in a general area, you can get type 2 in oral area. Nothing shocking. The distinction is that typically on the first case of genital-based herpes is much, and so it's simplex 2. Fairly severe. Ladies and gentlemen, this is one, once you've been exposed, you've been exposed. There's no getting away with it. It's now part of it. Herpetic viruses, that's the name that we give them. Once you have encountered them, they become latent in your body, in some way, shape, or form. But typically, they're associated, this goes back to something, maybe you're getting an ANP in the lab. Did you do dorsal root ganglia in the lab? Sensory nerves? Yes, no? Dorsal root ganglia is where they hang out. So they can be in the sacral nerve, they can be in cranial nerve, they can be in any nerve root. So a cranial nerve or spinal nerve roots. All can have these types. Well, here. So we know that these are spread sexually transmitted viruses. We know they are attendant to a lot of problems. It's a significant point. They can come back at any time. They go away, but they can. So you may have had a cold sore once and never have another. But it could be a recurrent problem. And the same is true for the genital-based herpetic infections. Fortunately, again, is the one that has the most reliable and effective and quote-unquote safest antiviral that's available. The one that all of us have been exposed to is right here. It's called BCV. Stands for varicella zoster. That means chicken pox. whether you were like me as a kid and got the chickenpox, or like my kids, or my kids are now very shortly will be between 39 and 42 years old, they all had chickenpox. Okay. Or for all of you who I am sure were immunized with, the varicella immunization. It's been pretty much standard operating procedure since, I'm going to tell you, 95, maybe a little earlier than that. You have all been exposed to chickenpox. The fact that you had the immunization doesn't make you designed to prevent you from getting the chickenpox. It did not limit your ability to get the shingles. You don't have to worry about getting the shingles. A third of us do during our lifetime. So whether you had the immunization, whether you had the disease, or you neither had neither, it's just a part of our environment. You were likely exposed to it and are carrying that virus within you. Take heart. And when we learn about the shingles, we talk about this. These are classified as skin diseases, as viral skin diseases. You're all going to be, unfortunately, potentially have this. Why we do it? It's the same thing with any latent virus. What makes it come out? We don't. Age, sure. Weakened immune system, sure. Major events in your life that are, you can be emotional trauma, social trauma, psychological trauma. The cases vary. Sometimes there's no trigger. My colleague here, who I teach with all the time, Dr. Buxton, who teaches physics, some of you may have had him, or will have him. He missed 3 weeks, just came out of nowhere. But he was probably, early 40s. And it was just, it's very uncomfortable, very unsightly, sometimes very, very painful. And other folks, it can be typically loss of a loved one will bring it on, something major, a life event that happens. We don't know a lot about these things. Again, it's almost like a slam dunk. As soon as something like that happens, they figure out, we're going to get another vaccine. So basically, there's a booster shot for a vaccine that is used for years ago, it's called Zostavax, which was a disaster name. Whether or not I never had it, whether or not that's efficient, I'm in an age group where you're supposed to have had it or it's been recommended. I declined the option, so to speak. So maybe one day it will impact me. I don't know, but I am not losing any sleep over all this. And I suppose one more. Many of you are familiar with, just because it's something that college students are familiar with, and that's this one. Last topic of the Zoom, called EBV. You named it, virus. It's associated with excess mononucleosis. So interestingly, sexually transmitted. Varicella zoster, absolutely not. Chickenpox, spread respiratory. Ladies and gentlemen, shingles ain't catching. You have to have the virus. So here, same category, you have sexually transmitted, respiratory spread. The Epstein-Barr infectious mononucleosis is surely blood-body fluid, kissing disease. Very, very common, easily spread, typically probably through saliva. What is it? Contact? It typically involves lymph nodes and lymph-related tissue that are there. Or chickenpox, however, when it enters respiratorily, its target, is different. So typically, once it gets in the bloodstream, the way it manifests itself is typically in skin cells and blood vessels going to skin cells. Of course, the problem. We'll go over those things when the time comes. That's the start of this. We're almost done with this, and we'll spend the rest of the other ones are fairly straightforward, and we'll begin RNA viruses on Friday. Thank you. I'll get that handout on herpes viruses to you shortly. Thank you. Back to the school.